Maggie, apparently.
I like this setup better anyways. All right, let's see here. Okay. We are live. How about that? Let me just record, and now we're going. All right, perfect. Welcome into another edition of Steak, Bourbon, and Sports, the show in which we eat steak, drink bourbon, and talk about sports. Sometimes one of three, sometimes two of three, sometimes three of three. And tonight, with Jeremy Mandel, I am Temkin. We welcome on Nick Smith, who is the foremost expert, according to Jeremy, in finding, identifying, and authenticating vintage bourbon and rye.
How's that for getting talked up?
I don't know. How much do I owe you for that introduction? Wow. Lot to live up to.
So Nick's been a friend of mine for a few years now. And one of the questions that I get a lot from people that listen, because, we talk about what we're drinking, and a lot of times what I'm drinking is something from like a long time ago. Whether a long time ago is 10 years or 100 years. People ask me lots of questions about that. So I figured good time to get Nick on. We can talk about either some people call it dusty whiskey, some people call it vintage whiskey, whatever you want to call it. Talk about that a little bit. And then Nick is also a big Cleveland Browns fan, so we can give him crap about that towards the end of the show.
Miserable life.
Yeah. How did you get into this in the first place? I don't think I've ever asked you that.
Honestly, there's a local guy here, and the way I got into whiskey was because I was at a business dinner. I was in my late 20s, and I was being introduced to some people, and I sat down at the country club, and everybody ordered drinks, and I didn't know what to order. I mean, I drank beer, right? I'm recent college grad or whatever, and didn't know much about wine, and I was a little embarrassed. I don't remember what I ordered, maybe like a Captain and Coke or something, and I thought, God, what a college kid drink, So I decided right then and there I was going to learn how to drink bourbon. But the dusty stuff came from a local guy that after I had picked his brain a little bit about bourbon, he had some stuff. And I think, Jeremy, you and I have since had many discussions about this particular bottle, but he found a cabin still hillbilly decanter in an antique store, like right around the corner from his restaurant. I go in there to eat. He pours me a drink of it, and it blew me away. And I was like, we got to talk about this. Where do I get this? How does this work? And so
what was it that blew you away about it?
It's been so long ago, and I was so new into bourbon, but it was just a completely different, it was a sweetness, and everybody talks about the older bourbons having like a butterscotch or a vanilla, and they're just so rich. And it just was unlike, it had more flavor and less booze, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally.
But it was just delicious, and it just blew my socks off. And I was like, we have to go down this rabbit hole.
It wasn't the penis hat.
It was. Yes, no, absolutely.
But that's not what kept you coming back.
Oh, no, certainly not. I don't even think I actually saw the decanter until much later. But he was like, yeah, this is...
Wait, explain that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so... What year was that, Nick? Do you remember?
Late 60s, 69, 70, okay. 68.
So
maybe.
Back in that era, a lot of whiskey companies would release their stuff in these glass decanters that looked like something. Wild Turkey would do wild turkeys. This particular company had was like an old man on a stoop or something like that.
Yeah, and he's got like a musket and a jug that says cabin still, and that was the brand.
Yeah. And
so he was the hillbilly, long beard.
Right. And his hat, if you turned it around and look at it from the backside, it is a penis.
It's very phallic.
I'm not saying that to like, it's not like this reminds me of that. That's what it was.
Clearly.
In that era, they would make jokes like that. And not just with whiskey. There's a whole... My grandfather thought it was funny, so he had a couple different antiques that are like that from around that same era, or I guess they weren't antiques around that era, but
I mean, it's like a peach color, like a skin colored hat, kind of like, I think it's supposed to be a straw hat, maybe.
Right.
But it is very, it's,
I mean, anybody like it, they're not trying to hide this. That's what it was.
Fantastic.
Who doesn't have a penis head? Who doesn't have one?
Well, that's and it's outstanding bourbon, but the thing that I always remember is the penis hat.
Right.
How could you not? How could you forget it?
Yeah, you don't forget that. So how do you know, like this, we've had drinks on this show that were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years old. When you actually get your hands on this stuff, I don't consume anything other than whiskey that is as old as that. So how do you know that this is like not going to make you die if you drink it?
So I guess, first of all, if you look at it, if you look at a bottle, if it's cloudy, that means it's oxidized and it's no good. And you can actually smell it when you open it. But just looking at a bottle, looking through the glass, if it looks like bourbon that you'd buy on the shelf today, then it's good. The only way it's not good is if it's oxidized and turned cloudy. Sometimes it'll have chunks in it. And those can come from the cork. Those can come from solids that were in the barrel. That doesn't usually alarm me as much. But I mean, if you can't, hold it up to a light and put your hand behind it and see through the whiskey, it's no good. Now, Jeremy was just talking about all these decanters, and some companies, bottled whiskey in a bottle and then they put it in a porcelain decanter, and the bottle might be worth a ton of money, but because you can't see what's inside that porcelain decanter, people don't really buy them or go after them too much because you don't know if you're getting a good one or a bad one. And it's a crapshoot. But when you open it and you pour it out and you pour it into a glass to drink out of it, or into maybe a larger container just to see what's in it, you can tell if it's clear or not, but you don't know what you're getting until you open it. So you might have bought something and got a dud.
Some of the greatest values that I've ever had in my life, or in the whiskey part of my life, at least, actually in all of my life, have been some of those old decanters, and you don't pay as much because if it's never opened, you have no idea what's actually in there. But last year I bought a bottle of decanter from Wild Turkey from the year in the 80s that I was born. Actually, Ari, you had some of this. I think I got it for $35.
Oh man!
Poured it into a mason jar. It looked perfect, and it was some of the just most gorgeous, delicious, awesome whiskey I've ever had.
What does that mean that it oxidizes, and how does that happen?
So oxidizing is oxygen getting into the bottle, so it's sealed, obviously. And most of these had a cork, and the corks can. This is actually a little tricky. It's the opposite of wine. You want to lay wine on its side and keep the cork moist and keep it expanded. Whiskey, the high alcohol content of the bourbon or the rye will actually eat away at the cork, and it can let oxygen in, let whiskey out, and then the cork particles get in. So that's the number one no-no, is laying an old bottle on its side. And people think because they've heard of wine being stored on its side, everybody wants to be like, oh, hey, I've got this whole bottle of whiskey I've had on its side, its whole life. And I'm like, oh, well, I probably don't want it,
Well, it's ruined.
Right, exactly. And the other thing that can happen,
wine, you idiot.
It's very true, and it's really unfortunate, the misconception there. But the other thing is the cork, if it's a bad cork or if it's in a extremely dry environment, can just shrink, and then oxygen just passes through the cork. So that's the other way that happens. And evaporation at the same time too.
How are you getting your hands on this stuff? I mean, obviously, there's probably not 50-year-old whiskey at my local liquor store.
Like Facebook Marketplace for
right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, how does this work?
Craigslist, is that what it is?
Well, so there's a lot of that, and I've got some of my own little tricks that I prefer to keep somewhat confidential.
Yeah, no, don't give away the farm here.
Because pretty easy to replicate, but really you're looking for trying to make connections with people. Probably the worst kept secret in dusty hunting is estate sales. There's people will have an estate sale and they'll take a picture of the bar, and they'll advertise the barware, and sure enough there'll be 4 or 5 bottles of bourbon sitting back there on the bar, and a lot of people don't know that it's worth anything. Now, again, I kind of have my own ways of getting connections, but people will call me up and they'll be like, I have these bottles that my husband got a bottle for Christmas every year, and he passed away 10 years ago, and he didn't even drink. And, I've got these bottles. I don't want them. And I was just going to throw them away, So I think there's a ton of that, but just really getting the word out and letting people know that, hey, I'm in the market. And however, maybe you devise to do that, but you're buying them from private individuals, and generally speaking, it's going to be older folks, I would say, that have had the stuff, or you're dealing with a child whose parents passed away and maybe is trying to clean out the house or whatever.
So you've got to encounter some pretty crazy situations.
Oh man, I tell you, I have been through the craziest one. Was a guy, he had some pretty nice stuff, and it was in his parents' house. His mom actually worked at a distillery, got a bottle every year for Christmas. They're pretty nice bottles. So he shows me a couple, but he just insists that he has more somewhere in the basement. So I pull up to this guy's house. The first thing I see is him standing out on the driveway, no shirt. He's probably in his mid 50s, big old beer gut, no shoes, and he's wearing like flannel pajama pants that literally, I don't know if they were mothball holes or if they were just like worn through, but this guy has cut off pajama pants on that have holes in them, and he's standing out there smoking a cigarette on the sidewalk, and I'm following him around his house. Oh, they could be, but literally I'm walking up the stairs behind this guy out of his crappy basement, and there's holes in the backside of his pants. And I'm just like, what am I doing with my life? It's just the lengths that I will go to for some dusty whiskey.
Did it pay off?
Well, hang on. Yeah, I want to know the end of the story.
It did. So he was kind of, I think he was kind of in tune with the fact that he had something. He had a lot of antiques at his house. So this was kind of like Pickers, where the guy goes out there and this guy kind of knows what he has. He wants to get rid of it, but he wants full value for it. So we bartered back and forth a little bit, and I let him keep a few of the bottles that I didn't want, but I ended up getting some bottles at a pretty decent deal and kept a couple of them. So yeah, all told, it probably wasn't worth my time, but I was already there, and I did get out with some stuff. So.
And you got to see that guy too.
Yeah, it's a fun story.
Is it all local for you? I mean, or do you have places all around that you're getting this from?
Well, it started local, obviously. I kind of tapped out the local market to the point where I had, been to all the places, and I had talked to people that run estate sales and those kind of things. And so I kind of started to expand, and now I'm driving to markets that are, a couple 100 miles away, and I will, put some feelers out, do some research, make some contacts, get a few calls lined up, and then I'll drive for a day and maybe stay overnight and spend the next day and maybe try to make 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 stops and pick up some whiskey. So I've come back with my car completely full.
Wow.
I think the biggest day I had, I bought probably 150 bottles in one day from about 7 different people.
Wow.
So
do you have any idea how much 150 bottles cost you?
Oh, in the low thousands. I mean, I can't remember exactly. The one guy that I got most of the bottles from, he had over 100 bottles. I think I paid him like $2,200 or something.
Wow.
And then the others were just a couple hundred here and there. So
what's the furthest you've actually gone travel wise for whiskey?
I'd say that's not really a super fair question, because I have some family up in the West Chicago suburbs. So I did some looking around up there, and when I was up with the family, I picked up a few bottles. So farthest away I've ever picked them up has been about 4 hours away, but just specifically a whiskey trip has been probably 2.5 hours away.
Okay.
How do you know what brands to look for?
That's where the knowledge, the reading, the talking to, being part of a community and talking to people comes in. There's certain things you can look for. The more you do it, you look for. So when I first started, and I told you, this guy that runs the restaurant, he gave me the cabin still, and I was enthralled, and I'm like, well, how do I know what to buy? You have all this knowledge. And he goes, look for age statements. He goes, look for bottled and bond. And he gave me like a few brands of whiskey, but he's like, stuff that is, higher proof. I think he said anything over 90 proof, anything bottled in bond. And he gave me a few brands. And then from there, it was kind of like, I've made a ton of mistakes. I mean, that's really where you learn most everything, is when you go spend too much on something and find out that you've, thought it was good and it's not, or whatever. But yeah, I make mistakes, and I guess live and learn. It's just experience and talking to people.
So favorite bottle that you've acquired this way, that you've opened and drank.
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that. Ugh, that's tough. I used to think that I was a huge Stitzel-Weller guy. Um, and Stitzel-Weller, I'm sure even if you don't know a ton about whiskey, everybody's probably heard of Pappy. So Stitzel-Weller was the original Pappy Van Winkle, the original guy who died in 1965. He was the master distiller for Stitzel-Weller. So anything like pre-65 Stitzel-Weller, I think probably my most memorable bottle was a 55 to 61 Old Fitzgerald decanter bottled in bond. That comes from the Stitzel-Weller distillery, and it just was everything that I thought bourbon should be. Since then, I still love Stitzel-Weller, but I'm kind of taking a page out of Jeremy's book in here, and that I've come really around to the national distillers. Yes, yes, and
My guy.
yeah, and so the ND stuff. I'm kind of a proof guy. There you go. There it is. I'm kind of a proof guy when it comes to Dusties, and National Distillers made an Old Grandad 114 that started in the early 80s, and man, that's special. I had a bottle of later stuff from the late 80s, and that was a really good bottle. So probably Old Fitzgerald or Old Grandad, I would say.
Yeah, it's funny because those are two brands that if you see now, like you go to a liquor store, you're going to see those brands, and they're not the same brands.
No, they're sure not. So this is a good segue. This is a good segue. So one thing I was going to mention is, what is Dusty? And I think everybody kind of has their own definition of it. And my definition of Dusty, and I could probably find a few people to agree with me, is anything pre 1992. So in 92, National Distillers, which had been around forever, sold out to Jim Beam. Or most of its brands, I think. I don't know if anything went anywhere else. And Old Fitzgerald, or the Stitzel-Weller distillery, also closed and sold off most of its brands to a combination of Bernheim and Heaven Hill. And that was, Jeremy, correct me or jump on here. I think that was a huge turning point in whiskey. There was some consolidation, kind of the changing of the guard, maybe, if you will. So, if you've got a bottle of 89 bourbon, I consider that Dusty. If you've got a bottle of 93 bourbon, I kind of consider that to be more modern. And that's kind of my dividing line.
The existence of national distillers is where I draw the line personally.
So explain ND, Jeremy.
National Distillers was a bourbon distiller that made a whole bunch of brands that are still on the shelves today. And in 1992, they sold out to, was it entirely to Jim Beam, Nick?
I don't think it was all Jim Beam, but most of the old Grandad.
Old Taylor went somewhere else.
Correct. Yeah. So there's a few.
Yeah. So people ask me my favorite stuff all the time. My favorite whiskey is 1980s and prior Old Grandad. And people who don't know about Dusty whiskey, when I tell them I have all these bottles, it's my big hobby, I'm all into this, my favorite drink is an Old Grandad, they look at me weird because they're like, I've had Old Grandad, it's garbage.
It's junk, yeah, bottom shelf.
And they're right. If you go buy it now, it is garbage. It's basically, I think probably the standard Old Grandad is probably the worst Beam product, other than just Jim Beam white label. And even then, I think you could have a conversation about it. But when it was made by National Distillers, Old Grandad was outstanding. And I remember in college, when I really started getting into whiskey, my grandfather's favorite whiskey was Old Grandad. And so I thought it would be cool. I'll go buy some of this Old Grandad stuff. It was my grandfather's favorite.
I could find it in a liquor store easily.
Yeah, it's no problem. And I was like, man, my grandfather had terrible taste.
This is awful. Although in college you drink like terrible alcohol anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I as opposed to Jack Daniels, I'm going to buy Old Grandad. It's not that big of a difference, at least then. So, I well, my grandfather had terrible taste, and then come to find out all these years later, he was drinking it in the 70s and 80s, and it turns out that's my favorite era of anything. There's great whiskey that you can find before the 70s and 80s. There's great whiskey you can find after that. But as a whole, just era-wise, I think that was the best era of whiskey ever.
It does make sense, though, that Old Granddad as a brand is only good like from the 70s and 80s. I mean, it's like the perfect name for a brand. It's like, don't get it today. It has to be Old Granddad.
That's right.
Very much on brand.
Yeah.
But yeah, so back in the day when National Distillers was open and operating, they were making outstanding whiskey. And, one of the things that I talk about on the show a lot is look at the proof of what you're drinking. And that'll tell you the alcohol content. That'll tell you how much did the manufacturer have to water it down or not water it down before they put it in the bottle. And 86 proof whiskey is not something made today that I will buy. There is no modern 86 proof whiskey that I would look at and say, yeah, I'm happy I have this. Old Granddad, the most common proof they had was 86 proof. And as a matter of fact, it's what I'm drinking right now. And it, for whatever reason, and there's lots of theories about why, I have no idea what the correct answer is. But 86 proof National Distillers Old Granddad beats the pants off of a lot of stuff made today that's barrel proof. Couldn't tell you why, but it's true.
What do you mean by beats the pants off? In taste? I mean,
in whatever category you want to use as your judge.
When you think higher proof, you think I'm going to get more drunk.
Right. Well, and more importantly to me, it's not a drunk or not sort of argument.
Right. That's what I was thinking.
So if you have high proof bourbon, that means that it came out of the barrel and either they didn't water it down at all or they watered it down very little.
Right.
So what you're getting in that bottle is the genuine article. Think about if you bought, if you're making some sort of food item, you're making dinner and you take a bite of it and then you pour a glass of water all over it and you take another bite of it, which one's going to taste better? And it's not any different with whiskey, really. So higher proof stuff is less watered down. You're getting more of the genuine flavors. You're getting more of the barrel. You're getting more of all the things that you look for in whiskey. So given that, it's completely mystifying to me that an 86 proof drink from the 70s or 80s is any good at all, but it's fabulous.
Is it possible that the aging has somehow evened it in a sense? So
theoretically, and Nick, cut me off if I say something dumb, which will probably happen. Theoretically, all aging ceases when you get it out of the wood barrel.
Right.
Because your age comes from the wood. The flavor comes from the whiskey moving in and out of the wood as the temperature goes up and down.
Plus, once you bottled it, you've introduced oxygen.
You've introduced oxygen, but if you do a good job sealing it, there shouldn't be a ton of oxygen coming in and out of that bottle.
Okay,
correct.
That's why, and there's a lot of feelings about this. That's why I like, now that they have synthetic corks, I like that a lot, because in theory it's not going to wear down over time, which means that I can keep a lot of the bottles that I like and hold on to it for a long period of time.
Huge improvement.
So back then that didn't really exist. So actually, except for a lot of the 86 proof Old Granddad, no cork whatsoever here, just simply a screw top. All it is. So I'm actually drinking this one tonight because I've had it open, and there are all kinds of ways to get dusty whiskey. One thing we haven't touched on at all is getting whiskey from outside the United States market. But that's another way to do that. And we'll talk about that now that I've remembered to bring it up. We'll talk about it in a second. But like, this bottle has all kinds of funky tack strips on it. And the reason that it has funky tack strips on it is because this was sold in Italy. So it was made in Kentucky, sent to Italy, sent back to the United States because I wanted it. So it took a whole long trip around the world just to get to me here in Texas. But I bought it about 2.5 years ago, and I've been drinking it slowly. This is a what's the year here? This is a 1973 bottle that I'm drinking tonight. And I started to realize, and we talking about oxidation, I've now had this and had it open for more than a year. So I feel like I kind of need to get on the stick with finishing this before the whole thing's blown.
Right. Right.
And especially with these screw tops. Maybe I screw it on all the way when I'm done having a few. Maybe I don't. But the only way to be sure that I'm going to get all of it is to just drink it all. So
yeah, how long before oxidation sets in on like a bottle like that, for instance?
I always say a couple years. I told a guy the other day that he opened a bottle and put a synthetic cork in it because the original cork was gone, and he said something about having like one drink a year out of it. I'm like, man, you need to have like more like one a month, like a month, and finish that off, that 24, 25 ounces off over, 2 years.
Yeah, once the seal's broken, the clock's ticking.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a couple of years is probably max. And the other thing, and I don't know, Jeremy, if you subscribe to this theory or not, but once you get that bottle where there's more air in the bottle than there is whiskey, say it gets down to that bottom third, that's not going to last the same as the first third lasts, because there's more air, more oxidation going on in there. So then it's time to really put the hammer down and finish that.
Right. Yeah. Like for example, I've got a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle that I bought and opened at the hospital when my daughter was born. You want to get a real strange look from a nurse, open up whiskey and start passing it around.
Really?
So I've been drinking it.
Excellent work.
Yeah.
At a birth? I mean, if you're like there for, like heart surgery maybe, but like it's a birth.
You're celebrating.
Yeah. And you got to understand, I was offering this to everybody, whether I knew them or didn't know them, whether they worked there or not. Everybody was getting Pappy Van Winkle offers. Anyway, the reason I bring that up.
Now I'm wondering why I wasn't there.
Because you didn't show up to the hospital. Had you come to the hospital, you would have had some. Many of your friends got some.
I thought never mind. I thought I did at some point.
Your wife came to the hospital.
Oh. Yeah.
She's a better friend. I say it all the time.
It's true.
But anyway, the reason I bring it up, that bottle, I mean, she now just had her 4th birthday last weekend, and we're on like the bottom 25% of this thing. Mm-hmm. So I've been saying, I'm only going to drink this on her birthday, but I'm looking at this saying, I don't know that the 25% that's in there is going to make it to the next birthday. It's now been open for 4 years. I do a good job keeping it closed and everything, but this is probably the year that I killed that bottle.
Time to go.
Yeah. So, you got to understand oxygen and the role that it plays, both positively and negatively with all this. It's a positive thing when it's in the barrel because oxygen will force it into the wood, but now it's out of the barrel and it can only mess with your whiskey now.
I love that you brought up the screw top conversation. That is a conversation I have all the time about the difference between corks and screw tops. So, I'll never forget. I had a buddy over here who's a big. He likes to have a good time, and we've had some good times together and whatnot. But he's not a whiskey guy. He drinks some beers and mixes a vodka drink or whatever. And so one night I have him and his wife over for dinner, and we eat some ribs and whatever. And I'm like, let's go down to the man cave and start drinking some whiskey. So he's sitting in the chair that I'm sitting in right now, and I poured him a bottle of 1943 Kentucky Nectar, and I believe that it was Evan Hill product. It was pretty tasty. And I poured him that, and he takes a drink of it, and he's got this look on his face like, what am I tasting here? It's clearly whiskey. And I said to him, did you get that old newspaper, old library book taste? And he was just like, oh, library books. That's what it is. And I'll never forget. He was like, mother effing library books. And he just that just resonated with him.
It's funny.
I had said that,
And I think this is now going to be the second time since the birth of this podcast that I'm bringing this show up. But Horace and Pete, which was a show with Louis C.K. and Steve Buscemi and Alan Alda and Edie Falco. It was about a family in New York that owned a bar, and they owned the bar for 100-something years. And in the first episode, Alan Alda pours this attorney a little bit of this whiskey, and he said, this whiskey bottle is the first bottle that was ever purchased for this bar. It's 100 years old. And the guy takes a sip of it, doesn't say anything, takes another sip of it. He says, "Oh my God, this feels like I'm drinking time."
That's exactly
And
right.
and when he said that, I wasn't a like I liked whiskey, but I wasn't like a I'm insane about whiskey kind of person. He said that, and I was like, I need to try older whiskey. Like I'm clearly missing out on something. And then I found a way to get a bottle of Wild Turkey from the early '80s, and then everything was different. But yeah, it's you get this sense of history with it that you really don't get with something on the shelf now.
I love to think about the fact that there was some guy, working at that distillery that, was working that still and, putting that into a barrel and rolling that barrel into a rick house. And then, it sat there. And this is all happening in I think the oldest bottle I have, I think, is around turn of the 20th century, 1920th century. So I don't know exactly, early 1900s maybe. But then I've got another one that was bottled in the spring of 1924, and I'm going to open that in the spring of 2024 when it's 100 years
Mm-hmm.
old. But I think to myself,
Right.
who is the guy that is long since gone? That was rolling this barrel around and putting this in the bottle and put it into a case, and where has it been and what has it seen, it really is an incredible
The
to think
most
of as a
important,
journey.
Yeah.
the most important part of whiskey is the conversation and the thoughts that you have and what you get to do while talking to somebody else while you're drinking it. And there's no cooler conversation to have while you're drinking whiskey than if you're drinking something that was put on the shelf 50 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. Um, it is. It's drinking time. It's history. And a little part of me kind of feels bad about, hey, this has been sitting around for 100 years. It's in great shape, and here I am going to be the one that, ruins that
Yeah.
or
Yeah, but
ends
you
that
appreciate
journey.
it in a way that maybe somebody else that would drink it that wouldn't appreciate it that
It's
same way.
true. It's
Well,
true.
I had I did an event for my clients with my real job about a year ago where it was dusty whiskey, or we called it whiskey through the decades. And we had whiskey starting
Mm.
at Prohibition and different eras along the way. Um, and somebody said, like, it's a really humbling experience that, and because we did with that basically exactly what you're talking about doing with your 1924 bottle, except the difference was that was a 1919 bottle, so last year was
Oh,
100
cool.
years. It was 100 years last year.
Wow.
And that it's a really humbling experience knowing that this has been sitting here waiting for 100 years just for me to take a sip of it tonight.
It is
And like
humbling.
all the stuff that's happened in the world and all it's and here and this bottle's been sitting there through all of it just to get to me tonight. It's a really cool, like, and this is possibly as dorky as I've gotten on this podcast, but it's a really cool thing.
No, I totally agree. I absolutely cannot wait. So the guy that kind of helped me procure that bottle, he's also a whiskey aficionado, and I message him probably maybe even once a month. I'm like, man, I can't wait till spring of 2024. I mean, I'm like, you're gonna get 48 text messages, between now and 2024 about how I can't wait to open this bottle, and it's gonna be an experience.
Right. It is kind of crazy to think like where the bottle started, where it's been, the things it's seen,
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote. I mean, it is, and there's a history lesson there too. I mean, you think about sort of the history of bourbon, the history of America. Like that's
Well,
inspiring too.
and that's one of the cool parts about it because there was a what we call a glut era of whiskey. This was like '60s through the early '80s, and people weren't drinking whiskey because James Bond said, "I want my martini shaken, not stirred," and then all of a sudden everybody wanted a shaken, not stirred martini.
Which, by
Yeah,
the way,
So
bourbon was super popular right after World War II. So like the
right,
50s and the early 60s would have been the golden era of bourbon, and that's where, all these big distilleries came online and you had people that really knew what they were doing and they were beefing up and making bourbon and people were drinking it and buying it. And then to Jeremy's point, that market kind of or demand died and supply was still in the barrels. And that's where the glut comes from.
What's crazy is in the Bond books, he drinks whiskey.
He said
That's the
shaken, not
craziest
stirred.
part. He literally drinks whiskey in the books.
He said shaken, not stirred in the movies, and that's what everybody wanted for like 2 decades after that.
Yeah.
So you had all of these distilleries that were having huge production because, to Nick's point, it was huge after World War II, and some guy in Kentucky had no way to know that James Bond was going to become a big deal. So they just kept making the same amount of whiskey that they ever made.
He drank whiskey in the books, but in the movies he wouldn't.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess the guy in Kentucky did not read the James Bond books. So they just kept making whiskey in that quantity, and it turned out years down the road, when the whiskey would have been mature, they didn't have the need for as much as they made, so they didn't bottle it. They just kept it in the barrel. So, like, for example, with the old granddad from National Distillers, most of the time, it's at least 4 years old, but a lot of the time it's way older than what they would say. Like Wild Turkey was famous for that. Wild Turkey would release 8-year 101 proof whiskey, and the only law is it can't be any younger than what you put on the label. It can be older, but it can't be younger. So there's a ton of 8-year 101. I actually got Jimmy Russell. I was doing a Wild Turkey pick in Kentucky. I got to talk to him about this. He said, yeah, there's a ton of Wild Turkey in the 70s and 80s that was far older than the 8 years that it said on the bottle. He said there was 15, 16, 17-year-old whiskey in there sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say at least twice as old at some point.
So the bottle just says 8 years. You don't know what you're getting, but in reality, it was some of the most well-aged whiskey ever released. There's one of my favorite whiskeys of all time is a Wild Turkey. It's called Cheesy Gold Foil, because the label was just on some cheesy gold foil. And I mean, Nick, do you know what is that? That's like an 18-year.
It's 12-year age stated.
But yeah,
I don't know what the actual age. I mean, it is much older.
I know it's significantly older than what the bottle says.
Yeah.
So they were having the opposite problem of what we're having now. Now, if they even tell you how old the whiskey is, you're lucky. And there was also a feeling at the time that if the whiskey's too old, it's gotten musty and bad. So they didn't want whiskey that was too old.
The consumer didn't want whiskey that was too old. There was a stigma about having an age statement that was, older than 8 years or a double digit, say, it's crazy. That's where the glut era came in, that you had all this really old whiskey and that's also where the decanters came from. So, Jim Beam starts making whiskey bottles in the shape of Corvettes or, fancy gold leaf trimmed whiskey bottles. And they told everybody that these whiskey bottles were going to be collectible. Hey, get the whole set, get all the Corvettes, and so, or the Ducks Unlimited. That's a huge one that I come across, being here in the Mississippi Valley with all the duck hunting. Everybody has a Ducks Unlimited Jim Beam decanter, and they think, oh man, this is worth a ton of money. And I'm like, man, it's still Jim Beam in there. I'm sorry, they told you it was going to be worth money, but it's not. So that's what they were trying to do, is peddle this whiskey any way they could, and it actually worked, because all these people went out and bought these collectible decanters, or so-called collectible, and put them on their shelves, and they bought the whiskey, they didn't drink it, and now I've got grandma and grandpa trying to sell me 30 bottles of Jim Beam, and I don't want them.
So you guys mind if I take a hard right turn?
Go ahead.
So, completely non-whiskey topic. This is a football topic, but I know both of you will have an opinion about this. Actually, it's a fantasy football topic.
Oh, yes.
So I have never been in a fantasy football keeper league before. I've always wanted to, but I've never actually done it. And this year, one of my friends is, I think, going to offer me a spot in this league. And it's a league that's been going on for 8-9 years. And I said, yeah, I'll do it. I'd love to do that. I've never been in a keeper league. And it didn't occur to me till later to ask, well, why is this team suddenly available 8-9 years in? Turns out the guy died.
Oh.
So now I don't know how to feel about this. where do you guys stand on taking over a deceased person's keeper fantasy football team?
Oh man, that's heavy.
I told you it was a hard right. It's a hard right turn.
How'd he die?
Does it matter?
I think so.
Natural causes. Like it wasn't like a car accident. He wasn't terribly old. It was a sad. Not that any death is not sad, but it was. I believe he got some. It might have been cancer. It might have been something else. But he passed away in his 40s or 50s. So I almost don't even want to see the roster, because the last thing I want is to like cut someone and get haunted in my dreams. And so I'm in this situation now where I told the guy, yeah, I'll take it, not knowing the whole story. Ooh. Now I know the whole story. And now I don't know if I'm like, well, no, I don't want a dead person's team. I can't say that.
So I guess my question is like in these kind of situations where it's kind of a tough question, put yourself in either another team member, like you're obviously a member of probably a couple fantasy leagues or more than a couple. Yeah, and say you kick off or one of your buddies kicks off, I mean, it wouldn't be weird for somebody to step in and manage the team. You'd want that to happen.
Well, yeah, I'd also haunt them.
You would probably, yes. Yeah, you probably would.
I would 100%.
Not in like a really demented way. Maybe in like just a football.
Yeah, like look, I'd show up in their dream and like basically be sitting in a leather chair having whiskey and be like, really, you traded Mahomes, huh?
Like, so what's the issue here? You're just. It would just be weird.
The issue is I feel icky.
Why? It's like a curse. You're not going to die just by getting this guy's team.
Is this a weird? Like, should I not feel this way?
People die all the time. Hundreds of thousands of people have died through coronavirus.
Well,
oh boy,
not this guy. But and I don't know that I would feel any different depending on how he died.
I feel like I would. I don't know why.
I feel like the 9 guys or 11 guys or whatever's left in that league, I feel like they're depending on you. You know how hard it is to find somebody to fill a fantasy football league spot? I mean, I think he wants his team to go on, and I think this league needs to keep going. I think it's true. You're stepping up,
You you have to keep this guy's memory alive, if anything.
Well, and what happens if I accept and I take the team, and the first time I log in, I'm like, oh my God, this team is awful.
Got the roster.
This is just terrible.
Well, I mean, there's a good chance that's the case.
Well, okay. So here's a fantasy football ethics question. Say you're one of the other 9. Actually, this is a 12-team league. So you're one of the 11 other guys, and you like the deceased person's team more than your own. Could you swap it?
Just not tell anybody. Be like, yeah, this is my team. Everybody play along. This is my team.
Everybody would know. Like, is that a faux pas? I don't know.
Yes. Yes, that's a faux pas.
It is?
Yes.
Okay. Well.
I don't know about that one.
Stealing another person's team because it was the better team, and then
it's not stealing. They're not. It's not theirs anymore. Like,
what do you mean? It is.
So, like, are you talking about before you step in? Like, he goes to the commission. He says, "Hey, listen, I know Joe's gone, but can you swap my teams and give Jeremy my team?"
I'm gonna. Right. Exactly. That's
yeah. That's way worse than.
I'm concerned about that because I know there's at least one person in this league who would absolutely do that.
That's his problem, not yours.
Yeah. Well, if I take the team, it could become my problem.
Well, that's true. Wow, that's an interesting one.
This is funny because as long as I've known you, Jeremy, you've been trying to reduce the amount of fantasy football leagues you're in.
And I still am. Like when I first met you,
seem to be scraping the bottom of the barrel here, going for the dead guy's team.
These things just come to me. I'm not asking.
Jeremy loves fantasy football. We can get him in our league.
I'm not asking for these situations. They just happen. Didn't put an ad in the paper like, leave your team to me. Like,
anybody die in your league, I'll happily take over.
And the interesting thing is, like,
You're like going to the
fantasy
hospital door to door. Like, are you dying? Do you have anything? Do you play
How's-
fantasy football?
how's your team this year? The
Who's your
interesting thing
commissioner?
is, like, this is like fantasy football is now like old enough that these things are happening.
Man, that's crazy.
Like,
Yeah,
not
I've got a
that
league
they,
that's been going since 07, I think. So.
right. And then my oldest league has been going since I think 04 or
Oh,
05.
wow.
And we're still going. We always at the beginning of every year we threaten to not do it anymore. And then, like, the week before the season comes and we're all like, I might as well do this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so mix that with the fact that I'm not even sure that there's going to be fantasy football or any kind of football.
Don't say that.
I mean, like, I'm certainly pulling for it, but like, who the heck knows? And if you're doing like fantasy baseball, which I don't play at all, but I would imagine it's gotten kind of turned on its ear. Like, if you happen to own any St. Louis Cardinals,
It'd be rough.
Like,
Yeah.
like
keeping
what
up with that week to week, game to game.
Well, and what happens, like, especially in fantasy football, NFL fantasy, it's a week to week game. And what happens if my team has to sit 3 weeks? Like, say the Raiders get a coronavirus outbreak.
Fantasy football is going to be a shit show this year. No question about it. I mean, it is,
and it's usually such an organized, dignified thing.
But I mean, but to that point, like, that's going to be. I mean, the NFL is going to play this year. They're going to play 16 games. They have to drag these players' lifeless bodies to the finish line.
You really think so?
Oh, I mean, yes, 100%. 100%.
Okay, I've been doubting it all along. I thought
they're
something's
going to
happen.
play, and they're going to play with replacement players or whoever they can find off the street. But they're going to play, no doubt about it.
Look,
no question.
Ari gets paid. Ari gets paid by the show. He's dragging Dak Prescott onto the field if he has to.
I've already lost 5 games. I've already lost 5 paychecks with the preseason being cut out and 5 preseason games for the Cowboys.
You know what's going to happen? The Browns are going to win this year. They're going to win the Super Bowl, and there's going to be big old fat asterisks by it. It's like, oh, they won, but it was Corona year. I mean,
well, if the Browns somehow do that, which is just north of 1% chance of happening, then we'll give the Browns their championship.
Oh, man. It's going to be some asterisks. I know it. I just could feel it.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But if it does, and the off chance that it does, the Browns can have it. Hey, that's the only team that can win where it won't be an asterisk.
Chubb is going to carry us all the way through. The rushing title, it's going to be fantastic.
There you go.
Nick,
improved offensive line.
Yes. Nick, I appreciate and a head coach that actually knows what he's doing. That'll help too.
Well, let's hope so. I think so.
Nick, appreciate you jumping on with us. This was a lot of fun, man. Great insights there on Dusty Whiskey.
Yeah, it was a great time. I really appreciate you guys having me, and fun to hang out. And I kind of nerd out on that stuff, so right in my element.
No, yeah, you're in good company, unfortunately, for both of us.
All right.
Jeremy, leave the people with something.
Find yourself some Dusty Whiskey this week and fare thee well.
Good call.
Nice. Awesome episode, guys. Thank you.
All right. Nick, thank you for doing this, man. That was fun.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you, guys. Appreciate
Great
you.
to meet you, Nick. Be well.
Yep. See you.
All right. Talk to you later.